It has been 8 years since Game of Thrones' disastrous final season. Perhaps the most divisive element of that season was Daenerys turning into a villain and destroying King's Landing, after previously being one of the show's most popular protagonists. Many fans, deeply upset by this dramatic change, have attacked the very idea that Daenerys will become a tyrant and a villain and destroy King's Landing. However, I think this is wrong. Whilst the show was undoubtedly very rushed and poorly written, and Daenerys' transition into a villain was handled terribly, nevertheless I think there is strong evidence to suggest that she will end up destroying King's Landing in the books, and that she will end up as a villain. Here's why. Firstly, many fans forget that George met repeatedly with the showrunners to tell them how the books would end. It wasn't like they just came up with it themselves. And whilst the execution of the plot lines was terrible, and it's likely they took some liberties such as giving Bronn Highgarden and other such things, I believe it is highly unlikely that they would have done something so profound as having Daenerys become a tyrant villain unless George had told them it was going to happen. It is a huge plot point, and if it didn't happen in the books, it would essentially turn the show from an adaptation to a completely different story. Whilst the show did change the story in some ways, I just do not think they would change it so drastically. With this argument laid aside, however, let's focus in on the books. What evidence is there from the books to suggest that Daenerys will go mad and burn King's Landing? During the first few novels, we have consistently seen Daenerys behave in heroic and positive ways, prioritizing the safety of civilians and fighting for a better world. Indeed, this has led her to become one of the series' most popular protagonists. We see her continuing dutiful nature on display during her long stay in Meereen, where she refuses to abandon the people she has liberated from slavery, even if that means being tied down in a messy, dirty and damaging series of wars that have seen her forces being brought to their knees. Yet it is here, with the Meereen plotline, that the series has become the most complex. Indeed, George R.R. Martin himself has described the Meereen plotline as, quote, the Myronese knot, and it is one of the main factors behind why The Winds of Winter is taking so long. The difficulty of resolving this plotline is slowing the whole series down. Whilst many fans interpret the Myronese knot as being George struggling with wrapping up this expansive storyline effectively, indeed the whole Slavers Bay plotline has become very complex, however, I believe this is not the core issue behind the delay. Rather, I believe this knot refers to the difficulty George is having in turning this fan-favourite protagonist into a villain, which I believe will happen. The following interpretation was written by a man named Feldman, and in an interview, George declared that Feldman had it absolutely right. So let's see what he had to say about what the purpose of the Meereen plotline really is. Quote, with that in mind, a closer look reveals that Daenerys' plotline in Meereen has been very cleverly designed as a series of tests of her values, and one value in particular. Each test is designed to ask, how far will Daenerys go to make peace and protect lives? With nearly every new chapter, Daenerys is asked to give up something else she wants or desires, for the good of the Myronese people. The use of her dragons, a share of power in Meereen, some of her anti-slavery reforms, her desire for vengeance, her desire to right every wrong she sees, her distaste for cultural practices she finds abhorrent, her happiness, her chance at Westeros. Daenerys' story is revealed in how she responds to these tests, and how she tries to balance her moral ideals against her own darker impulses and desires. Part of her genuinely does want peace, and wants to sacrifice a great deal to protect lives. But another part of her would rather she take what she wants through violence. The main drama of the Meereen plotline lies in her mind and in her choices. On the surface, she is struggling with the Meereenese, but her most important struggle is with herself, and the outcome of this struggle will have momentous consequences for Westeros. End quote. I believe, for the reasons that will now be described, that George intends for Daenerys to succumb to her desires and turn from a protagonist to a villain. And I believe that it is making this transition feel convincing that is taking up so much of George's time, especially after how the show was received, where people felt her transition was not believable. However, leaving aside the difficulty of staging this transition, what is the evidence that George is planning for Daenerys to end up destroying King's Landing? Well, the simplest evidence is contained during two scenes. The first is from the very first book in the series. In it, the following is said: "But it was not the plains Daenerys saw then. It was King's Landing and the great Red Keep that Aegon the Conqueror had built. It was Dragonstone where she had been born. In her mind's eye they burned with 1,000 lights, a fire blazing in every window. In her mind's eye all the doors were red." This scene from Daenerys' third ever chapter shows quite clearly that King's Landing and the Red Keep are going to end up destroyed, and they won't be destroyed by the others. Rather, as she sees herself, a fire will blaze in every window. This strongly suggests there's going to be a massive fire in King's Landing, and it won't be wildfire. Wildfire is green. No, it will be simple red fire, dragon fire. And who else has dragons but Daenerys? Furthermore, Daenerys now has Tyrion as an advisor, and unlike in the show, where Tyrion is this nice guy who wants to make the world a nicer place, book Tyrion is increasingly described as angry, violent, and he wants to utterly destroy House Lannister and do some vile things. With him by her side, I think Daenerys will be further pushed towards brutality. Now, arguably the strongest textual evidence to suggest Daenerys will destroy King's Landing comes from the second novel in the series, particularly the scene that takes place within the House of the Undying. In this house, Daenerys receives several visions of the future. One of them is of, quote, a burning city. Then it states, quote, "From a smoking tower, a great stone beast took wing." Now, I think this is a reference to Drogon. Indeed, the dragon eggs from which her dragons hatched had turned to stone. And in the show, we see Daenerys set up her headquarters on Dragonstone, where she was born. Ultimately, dragons are heavily linked with stone in this series. Finally, King's Landing being destroyed was foreshadowed as early as Season 2 in the show, where we see Daenerys have a vision of the Iron Throne and Throne Room after it has been destroyed, with snow falling through a broken roof. What could have destroyed the Red Keep except Daenerys and her dragons? Indeed, this is exactly what we see in Season 8, and demonstrates that the Red Keep being destroyed had been fought out long before the end of the series. And remember, this was when Martin was still heavily involved in writing the show. Why would they include it if it was not part of his plan? Finally, I think the series name itself is foreshadowing Daenerys going mad and being betrayed. A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it is reasonable to interpret fire as referring to Daenerys and her dragons. The interpretation of ice remains more controversial. On the one hand, it is commonly taken to mean Jon Snow. Indeed, it appears likely that Snow and Daenerys will have a very close relationship during the Long Night. Rather, I think it is more likely that the ice refers to the ancestral Stark greatsword. I think it is not a coincidence that the earliest scene that George ever wrote for the series was the scene where Ned executes the Night's Watch deserter using this sword, ice. Thus, it was clearly a core element of his initial world building, right around the time when he gave it the series its name. Secondly, most people do not know this, but the Valyrian greatsword we see in the books is not the first version of the sword ice. Rather, it is named after an earlier, mythic sword wielded by the ancient Starks, which was apparently made of real ice. But what does this have to do with Daenerys going mad? Well, I believe it explains how Daenerys will die, and who will kill her. In a deleted version of a scene from A Dance with Dragons, Daenerys experiences a nightmare. In this nightmare, she kisses a man with pale skin and blue lips, whom she initially believes to be Daario, but likely isn't. However, as they are kissing, when his manhood enters her, it is, quote, as cold as ice. And when she awakens, she remembers there being a twisted blade inside her. Now, the resemblance between this dream and how Daenerys eventually dies in the show is striking. She is kissing a man whom she believes she loves, only for her to be stabbed by a blade as cold as ice, and to collapse with the twisted blade still inside her. This is basically exactly what happens in the show. The only difference is the weapon, which I believe may end up being the mythical blade Ice from the Age of Heroes, whereas in the show it's just a random dagger. Thus, I believe it is likely that Jon Snow will indeed end up in a romantic relationship with Daenerys, only to end up betraying her and stabbing her to death. This leaves the obvious question: what could turn Jon Snow, a man whose sense of loyalty has been consistently affirmed in the books, to make such a drastic and out-of-character decision? In my opinion, it could only be that Jon Snow genuinely ends up believing that Daenerys has gone mad and poses a danger to the world, and perhaps to his own family. This would mark the final of the 3 betrayals that Daenerys is likely going to experience. She will be betrayed for love. But whose love? I think it will be Jon's love for his family and the 7 kingdoms. Finally, there is the fact that George has publicly stated that the ending to A Song of Ice and Fire will be bittersweet. He says he is especially inspired by the ending of The Return of the King by Tolkien, where the heroes win but Frodo ends up broken. And I simply believe that Daenerys ending up as a simple heroine who saves the world and settles down to married life is way too sweet an ending for this series. There is no way that such an ending can be considered bittersweet. Finally, there is the fact that George has publicly stated that the ending to A Song of Ice and Fire will be bittersweet. And I simply believe that Daenerys ending up as a simple heroine who saves the world and settles down to married life is way too sweet an ending for this series. There is no way that such an ending can be considered bittersweet.